Get off my land. Ruby Garner's voice did not shake. It never shook. Not when her father had died in the middle of a drought year, leaving her with nothing but 200 acres of sun-cracked Texas soil and a mule with a bad leg. Not when the bank had sent its first letter, ink still fresh and threatening. And certainly not now, standing on the warped porch boards of the only home she had ever known, staring down the barrel of a man's ambition. Monroe Chandler did not move. He was tall enough to block the afternoon sun, broad enough to cast a shadow over half her porch, and confident enough to make most people in Laredo County step aside without a word. He had already made 4 offers. Each one had been more generous than the last. Each one had been refused. "Miss Garner," he said, and his voice was careful, measured, the kind of voice a man uses when he is trying very hard not to sound like what he actually is. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I am here because what I am offering you is a fair price. More than fair. You could leave this place and never worry again." "I said get off my land," Ruby repeated. She was 26 years old, with hands that were rougher than most men's in the county, and a jaw set so firmly it might have been carved from the limestone bluffs along the Rio Grande. Her dark hair was pinned back, a few strands escaping in the hot August wind. Her brown eyes held no uncertainty, only fury, and beneath the fury, something that Monroe Chandler could not quite name, something that looked, if he was being honest with himself, a great deal like grief wearing the costume of anger. He had been warned about her. Half the men in town had warned him. Hector Vance at the land office had laughed and said, "Good luck with that one, friend. She told the last fella who tried to buy her out to go straight to the devil and take his money with him." The sheriff had simply shaken his head. The widow Pierce at the general store had leaned across the counter and said, low and serious, "Ruby Garner would sooner burn that farm to the ground than sell a single acre, and you would do well to remember it." Monroe had not listened to any of them, because Monroe Chandler had not built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties by listening to warnings. He had built it by pushing through walls that other men walked away from. But standing on Ruby Garner's porch, watching her dark eyes burn with something he could not simply negotiate away, Monroe felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he might have met a wall he could not break through. He took off his hat, held it against his chest, and said something he had not planned to say. "I know what this land means to you." Ruby's expression shifted just barely, a fault line appearing in stone. Then it sealed itself shut again. "You do not know a thing about me or this land, Mr. Chandler. Now I will not ask again. Get off my property before I get my rifle." He left, but he did not forget her. The story of how Monroe Chandler and Ruby Garner arrived at that moment on that porch, facing each other like 2 storms refusing to yield, began 6 weeks earlier, in the late summer of 1882, when the railroad company sent its first surveyor through Laredo County, and the ground beneath every small farmer in the territory suddenly became worth more than any of them had ever imagined. The Kansas and Southern Pacific Railroad had been pushing its line southwest for 3 years, and the men behind it had decided the most profitable route would cut directly through Laredo County and out toward the Mexican border, which meant they needed land. And the man they hired to acquire that land quietly, efficiently, and without causing the kind of headlines that made investors nervous was Monroe Chandler. It was not simply a business arrangement. Monroe owned the Chandler Cattle Range, 40,000 acres stretching north and west of town, and the railroad coming through would increase the value of his existing holdings by a factor that made his head spin if he thought about it too long. He was 32 years old, had been running his operation alone since his father passed 4 years prior, and had always understood land as the only thing in this world that was both permanent and honest. You worked it. It gave back what you earned. Simple and true. The trouble was, the railroad needed a particular corridor, a strip of land running from the northern edge of Monroe's range, through 3 smaller farms and directly across the southern end of the Garner property before connecting to the existing line near the border, Without that corridor, the route was useless. The railroad's men had been plain about it. Get all the parcels or get none of them. The whole deal falls. Monroe had already purchased 2 of the 3 smaller farms without much difficulty. Old Tom Briggs had been looking for a reason to move closer to his daughter in San Antonio, and the offer Monroe made gave him more than one reason. The Delgado family, who had been struggling since their irrigation well collapsed, accepted with relief and gratitude. 2 down. Ruby Garner was the last piece. He rode out to see her on a Thursday morning in early July 1882, expecting the same kind of conversation he had already had twice. A fair offer, some consideration, a handshake. He had prepared a number that he believed was genuinely generous, because he was not a dishonest man, and he did not like operating as one even when the stakes were high. He found her mending a fence line on the western edge of her property, alone, working with the kind of steady, methodical focus that told him she had been doing hard physical work her entire life. She was wearing a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her boots were worn through at one heel, and there was a smear of red mud along her left cheekbone that she had not bothered to wipe away. She heard his horse and turned, shading her eyes against the sun. She did not seem afraid of a strange man riding up to where she was working alone. She simply looked at him with calm, assessing eyes and waited. Monroe introduced himself. He told her about the railroad, about the corridor, about what the land would be worth once the line came through. He made his offer. He was polite and straightforward and said everything he meant to say. Ruby listened to every word. Then she said, without any particular heat in her voice, just clear and plain and final, "My farm is not for sale." He rode back to town telling himself she simply needed time to consider the offer. That was reasonable. That was human nature. He gave her a week and came back. "My farm is not for sale," she said again, this time from the doorway of her barn, not even turning fully to face him. He raised the offer by 20% and returned 10 days after that. "Mr. Chandler," she said, setting down the bucket she was carrying and looking at him directly, "I have been very clear with you. My farm is not for sale. Not for the price you are offering, not for double the price, not for any price you could name. I am asking you for the last time to stop coming here." He came back anyway. Which brought them to that moment on the porch, her eyes burning, her voice like flint, telling him to get off her land before she reached for her rifle. What Monroe did not know, what he could not have known from the outside, was what that land represented to Ruby Garner in ways that money simply could not touch. Her father, James Garner, had come to Texas from Missouri in 1861 with nothing but a mule, a pocket knife, and a letter from his own father that said simply, "Find something worth keeping." James Garner had found this land. He had spent 20 years building it into something real, something permanent. He had buried 2 children on its soil, lost his wife Eleanor to fever in 1874, and kept going, because the land was the one thing in his life that did not leave him. When James died in the spring of 1880, Ruby was 24 years old. She had been helping run the farm since she was old enough to carry a bucket, and she had watched her father love this place with a devotion that went beyond any ordinary attachment. He had not simply farmed it. He had made it his reason. And when he died, the responsibility of preserving that reason fell to Ruby, and she accepted it the way she accepted everything, completely and without flinching. She had kept the farm running for 2 years on her own. It had not been easy. It had not been anything close to easy. The drought in 1881 had killed a quarter of her cattle. She had sold her mother's silver tea service to pay the property tax. She ate simply, worked constantly, and refused every offer of help from the neighbors in town who thought, kindly or otherwise, that a young woman alone on 200 acres was a problem waiting to happen. She was not a problem. She was a rancher, and her farm was not for sale. Monroe rode back to town after the 4th refusal with something unusual happening inside his chest, something he could not immediately identify. It was not frustration, though there was some of that. It was not admiration, though there was some of that too. It was something more unsettling than either. Something that made him pull his horse up short on the road back to Laredo, stare out at the flat horizon for a long moment, and ask himself, very quietly, what in the world he was actually doing. He had the railroad's money in a bank account in Austin. He had the authority to make offers that most people in this county had never seen in their lifetimes. He had 2 properties already secured and a deal that depended entirely on the third. And he had been thinking about Ruby Garner almost continuously for the past 6 weeks, in a way that had very little to do with land acquisition. He thought about the way she looked at him, direct and unafraid, as if she could see straight through the business arrangement to whatever was underneath it. He thought about the red mud on her cheek the first day, and the fact that she had never asked him to wait while she cleaned herself up, never seemed embarrassed by the evidence of her work. He thought about the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes and the way her voice, even when it was telling him to leave, sounded like something absolutely honest. He found himself thinking about her at night, which was new and inconvenient, and not something he had experienced in quite this way before. Monroe Chandler had been around women. He was not a monk, but something about Ruby Garner worked on him in a way that felt different from anything in his previous experience, and that difference was beginning to complicate a business situation that was already complicated enough. He needed her land. He was also beginning to suspect, in the way a man suspects something true before he is fully prepared to accept it, that he was falling in love with the woman who refused to give it to him. This was the specific variety of trouble that no one had warned him about. In the meantime, Ruby was dealing with a problem of her own, one that she had not told anyone about because telling anyone would have required admitting that the situation existed, and Ruby's relationship with asking for help was even more strained than her relationship with selling land. 2 months before Monroe Chandler first rode up to her fence line, a man named Holt had come to see her. Holt was not offering to buy her land. He was offering to lease it, which on the surface seemed like an entirely different thing, but which Ruby recognized immediately as the same thing wearing different clothes. Holt ran a cattle outfit south of the county line, near the border, and his reputation was the kind that made people choose their words carefully when they discussed him in public. Holt had not made a polite offer. He had made a statement disguised as an offer, the kind where the threat lives in the spaces between the words, never said directly but felt clearly. He wanted to run his cattle across her southern pasture for a fee that was insultingly small, and when she refused, he had smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes and said he was sure she would think on it further. Since then, 3 of her fence posts had been pulled out of the ground on the eastern edge of her property. 2 of her cattle had gone missing. A brush fire had started along the southern fence line, and she had fought it herself, alone, for 4 hours before it burned itself out against the rocky ground near the creek. She could not prove any of it was connected to Holt. She could feel it in her bones with the certainty of someone who had grown up reading the land, but feeling and proving were 2 entirely different things in a county where Holt had been known to spend money in ways that encouraged certain men to look in certain directions. She could not go to the sheriff. Not because Sheriff Wade was corrupt, but because without proof, all she had was a frightened woman's accusations, and she would not be a frightened woman, would not perform fear for anyone, so she repaired the fences herself. She searched for her missing cattle and found one of them 3 miles east with a stranger's brand scorched over her father's mark. She set a careful watch on her southern pasture and slept with her father's Winchester rifle beside the bed. And she refused to sell her land because selling her land to anyone, even Monroe Chandler with his genuine offers and his disconcerting habit of looking at her like she was a language he was trying to learn, felt like surrendering to the pressure that Holt was applying, even though Holt's pressure and Chandler's offers were 2 completely separate things. It was the sheriff's deputy, a young man named Ellis Prout, who accidentally connected the threads. Ruby had gone into Laredo on a Friday in mid-August to collect her mail and buy lamp oil, and Ellis caught her outside the post office with the particular expression of someone who had information they believed was both important and difficult to deliver. "Miss Garner," he said, dropping his voice to a level just above a whisper, "I heard something this week that I think you ought to know about. Maybe it ain't my place, but I think you ought to know it anyway." Ruby waited. Daltrey Holt and a fellow from the railroad company had a meeting at the saloon Tuesday night, Ellis said. "I was not meant to hear it, but I did." Holt was telling this railroad man that he had a way to clear the Garner property for the railroad's corridor, said he had been applying some pressure and expected the owner to sell within the month, or to simply abandon the property and save everyone the trouble. Ruby went very still. "He was talking about you," Ellis said unnecessarily. "I understand who he was talking about," Ruby said. The railroad man seemed interested, very interested, asked how Holt planned to manage it. "And what did Holt say?" Ellis's expression became uncomfortable. "Said he had more tools in his kit than fence posts and brush fires." Ruby stood in the afternoon heat of Laredo's Main Street and felt something she almost never allowed herself to feel. Fear. The genuine, physical kind, moving through her chest like ice water in August. More tools in his kit. She knew what that meant. She had always known men like Holt understood that isolated women on isolated properties were vulnerable in ways that went beyond property damage. She bought her lamp oil and rode home without stopping to talk to anyone else. And that night she sat at her father's kitchen table with the Winchester across her knees and tried to think her way through what was actually happening. Holt wanted her land, or rather, Holt had sold the promise of her land to the railroad without first securing her agreement, which meant he had made a promise he could not keep by honest means. And now he was working to make it true by dishonest ones, which meant the railroad's deadline was his deadline, and the pressure he applied to her would increase as that deadline approached. She did not know the name Monroe Chandler yet, at least not as someone connected to the railroad. She knew him only as the man who kept coming to her door with offers that were, she had to admit, genuinely fair. She had not connected his repeated visits to Holt's machinations, because in her mind they had been separate things. A land buyer who was persistent but honest, and a dangerous man who was applying pressure through destruction. She sat at that table for a long time, and sometime after midnight, she arrived at an unpleasant but unavoidable conclusion. She could not handle Daltrey Holt alone, not the kind of threat Ellis Prout had described. She was capable and stubborn and resourceful, but she was also one woman against a man with money and men, and no apparent concern about the law. She needed someone who could operate at Holt's level. What she did not know yet was that Monroe Chandler was the man who could do exactly that. Monroe spent 3 days after his fourth failed visit riding the perimeter of the railroad corridor and trying to find an alternative route that would satisfy the company's engineers. He hired the only surveyor in Laredo County who was not already working for Holt, a quiet, thorough man named Samuel Wright, and they spent 2 full days in the field together. The verdict was the same as it had always been. There was no viable alternative. The Garner property was the only route. Monroe sat with this information in his office, a single room at the back of the Chandler Ranch house that was organized with military precision, and stared at the map pinned to the wall. He had not been fully honest with himself about his motivation for wanting to find an alternative route. He told himself it was professional pragmatism, that if he could give the railroad a different option, the problem would solve itself. But the truth, the one he was finally becoming willing to look at directly, was that he did not want to force Ruby Garner off her land, not because the deal required it, not because he could not afford a different route, but because the thought of it felt wrong in a way he could not rationalize past. He was 2 days into this uncomfortable self-examination when Samuel Wright came back to the ranch with something unexpected. "You know who Daltrey Holt is?" Wright asked, setting his survey equipment against the wall of Monroe's office. "I know of him," Monroe said carefully. Man who runs cattle south of the county line. Not well regarded. Not well regarded is a polite way to put it, Wright said. I heard something today that I think you ought to hear. He paused. I was having my noon meal at the Cattlemen's Rest, and two of Holt's men were talking at the next table. They were not being especially quiet about it. Holt has been telling his men that the Garner property is practically his already, that the woman will be off it within the month, and he will collect the railroad money for delivering the parcel. Monroe went very still. He told his men the railroad money. He told them the railroad money, Wright confirmed, which means he made a private arrangement somewhere without actually owning the land. And he has been working to force the woman off her property to make good on it. Monroe stood up slowly. The fence posts, he said, more to himself than to Wright. The brush fire. Wright looked at him steadily. You knew about those things. I knew about the fire, Monroe said. She had a fire along her south fence line 3 weeks ago. I rode past the property 2 days after and saw where it had burned. He had not mentioned this to anyone because he had not known what to do with the information and had not wanted to consider what it might mean. I did not know about fence posts. Holt's men were laughing about it, Wright said, and his voice was flat with distaste. Said the woman keeps fixing what they pull out. The thing that happened inside Monroe Chandler at that moment was not a business calculation. It was not a strategic assessment. It was something much older and more fundamental than either of those things, a plain and overwhelming outrage that settled in his chest and did not move. Someone was terrorizing Ruby Garner, on her own land, in the hope of forcing her off it, and the situation had been connected, however indirectly, to the very railroad deal that had brought Monroe to her door in the first place. He made 3 decisions in rapid succession. First, he was going to find out everything he could about Daltrey Holt's arrangement with whoever in the railroad company he had been dealing with, because if someone had made promises to Holt using the railroad's resources and authority, that was fraud and he was not going to be party to it. Second, he was going to go see Ruby Garner, not with an offer, not to buy her land, but to tell her what he had just learned and to offer whatever help she would accept. Third, he was going to deal with Daltrey Holt in a manner that left no ambiguity about the situation. He knew the third decision was probably the most dangerous one. He was also aware, in the clear, honest part of his mind, that he was making it not as a business decision but as a personal one, and that this distinction was significant. He rode to the Garner farm the next morning. Ruby saw him coming from the window of her kitchen and felt the familiar tightening of her jaw. Another offer, another version of the same conversation. She wiped her hands on her work apron and stepped out onto the porch and prepared to send him away again. But Monroe Chandler rode up to her fence and did not look like a man coming to make an offer. He looked like a man who had something difficult to say and had decided to say it anyway. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked to the gate without the careful, businesslike energy she had come to expect from him. He looked, if she was being accurate, troubled. "Miss Garner," he said, "I am not here about the land." She studied him for a moment. "Then what are you here about? May I come in? I have information that concerns you, and I think you should hear it while we are both standing still." She considered this for a long, measuring moment. Then she nodded and stepped back from the door. She had never had Monroe Chandler inside her house before. He was too large for the small kitchen, not in a way that was clumsy, but in a way that changed the proportions of the room, made the hand-hewn table and the iron cook-stove, and the shelves of her mother's preserved jars feel both smaller and somehow more real than they had a minute ago. She offered him a seat because she had been raised to have manners even in the midst of adversity, and he sat across from her at the table and told her everything Wright had told him. Ruby listened without interrupting. Her face was very controlled, but her hands, resting on the table, had gone slightly white around the knuckles. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "More tools in his kit." Monroe frowned. "I beg your pardon. Something I heard earlier this week," she said, "about Holt, about his intentions." She looked at Monroe directly, the way she always did, without any softening of the gaze. "How did Holt connect himself to the railroad? Do you know who in the company he made his arrangement with? Not yet, Monroe said, but I intend to find out. I have a business arrangement with the railroad company in Austin, and I will tell you plainly that I did not know about Holt's involvement in any of this. If someone in that company authorized Holt to apply pressure on landowners as a means of clearing the corridor, that is a fraud that I want no part of. Ruby watched him. Why are you telling me this? The question was direct and honest and deserved a direct and honest answer. Monroe met her eyes and said, because what is being done to you is wrong, and because I played a part in creating the situation that someone like Holt has exploited, even if that was not my intention. And because I would like to help if you will allow it. Something moved in Ruby's expression, not softening exactly, but a shifting, the way a river changes direction when it encounters a different kind of ground. You have been trying to buy my farm for 6 weeks, she said. I have, he said, and I will tell you honestly that I am not here today with any intention of making another offer. I am here because you are in danger and I know about it and I cannot ride away from that. She was quiet for a long time. The August light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them, warm and golden and full of dust motes. The mule brayed somewhere outside. A mockingbird started up in the old mesquite tree by the barn. What kind of help? She asked finally. Monroe had been thinking about this on the ride over. First, I find out who in the railroad company made the arrangement with Holt. That is business, and I know how to handle it. Second, I send 3 of my own men to keep watch on your property for the next several weeks, people I trust absolutely, while we figure out the larger situation. Third, I pay a visit to Holt and make it very clear that his activities on your land are finished. Your men on my land, Ruby said slowly. That requires trust. It does, Monroe agreed. And I understand that I have not given you any particular reason to trust me. I have given you 4 reasons to be angry with me. For the first time in any of their encounters, Ruby Garner almost smiled. It was not a complete smile. It was the shadow of one, arriving and departing quickly like a bird landing and then thinking better of it. 5, she said. You forgot the time you came back the day after I told you not to. Monroe felt something move in his chest, warm and unsteady. I apologize for that, he said, genuinely. The almost smile returned, stayed slightly longer this time. I will take your men on my south fence line, she said, on the understanding that this is not a concession about the land. Understood completely, he said, and I want to know what you find out about Holt and the railroad company. I want to know it directly, not through the deputy or through town gossip. You have my word. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they have made a decision and have no intention of second-guessing it. All right, Mr. Chandler. He stood up, put on his hat and moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. He did not fully understand why he said the next thing except that it was true and seemed important. Your father built something worth keeping, Miss Garner. I can see that clearly. Ruby looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read. Something that moved beneath the surface of her controlled face like water moving beneath ice. Yes, she said. He did. Monroe Chandler sent 3 of his most reliable ranch hands to keep watch on the south and east fence lines of the Garner property. He trusted these men the way a man trusts people he has worked alongside for years in difficult conditions, completely and without qualification. He chose Walt Emery, his head foreman, who was 50 years old, steady as stone, and had once tracked a stolen horse herd across 2 counties and brought them all back. He chose brothers named Carson and Dex Hooper, who were both in their late 20s, competent riders, and had the particular quality of being able to sit still and watch for long periods without losing focus. He wrote a telegraph message to the railroad company's regional office in Austin, addressed to the vice president he dealt with directly, a man named Arthur Cleve. The message was careful and businesslike and said, in language that was politely worded but unmistakably serious, that Monroe had become aware of a third-party arrangement regarding the Laredo County corridor and required a full accounting of it before proceeding further with the acquisition. Then he rode south to find Daltrey Holt. He found him at his ranch headquarters, a collection of weathered buildings behind a split-rail fence, sitting on his porch smoking a cigar with the particular leisure of a man who believes himself untouchable. Holt was perhaps 45, heavyset and sunburned, with small eyes that measured everything they rested on in terms of what it was worth to him. Monroe rode up, did not dismount, and looked down at Holt from the height of his saddle. "I need you to understand something clearly," Monroe said, without preamble. "Whatever arrangement you made with whoever you spoke to at the railroad is not your arrangement to make. The corridor acquisition is mine to manage. You have no authority to act on behalf of the railroad or anyone connected to it, and the activities that have been occurring on the Garner property, the fence posts, the fire, the missing cattle are finished. Today, if I hear of anything else occurring on that property, I will take the matter to federal authorities." Holt looked up at him with those small, measuring eyes and took a long pull on his cigar. "You have a lot of confidence for a man standing on my property," he said. "I have accurate information," Monroe said, "which is worth more than confidence. I know who you spoke to at the railroad. I know what you promised them. And I know that the arrangement you made is not legal, because the person you made it with did not have the authority to authorize it, which means you have made yourself liable for whatever has been done on the Garner land, and you have done it for a promise that is not worth the paper it was written on." Something shifted in Holt's small eyes, the first trace of uncertainty. "You are bluffing," he said. "I am not a man who bluffs," Monroe said. "I am a man who does exactly what he says he will do. Leave the Garner property alone. You will not get your money and you will not get the land. If you push this further, the only thing you will get is a conversation with federal marshals." He turned his horse and rode back toward Laredo without looking back. His hands were not entirely steady on the reins until he was a mile down the road. 3 days later, a telegram came from Arthur Cleve in Austin. It was long and formal and exceedingly careful in its wording, which told Monroe everything he needed to know about how much the company knew and how worried they were about it. The substance of it was this: a junior acquisitions agent named Holt had indeed approached a mid-level railroad official named Sims with an informal proposal. Sims had not authorized anything formally, but had suggested that if Holt could deliver a signed deed for the Garner property, the company might be in a position to offer a finder's fee. This had not been sanctioned by Cleve or by anyone above him, and the company was deeply interested in ensuring that the situation was resolved without further complications. In plain language, someone had been dangling money in front of Holt without the authority to do so, and the company was now very eager to pretend this had never happened and equally eager for Monroe to fix it. Monroe wrote back. He fixed it. Sims was removed from his position. Holt's informal arrangement was formally dissolved in writing, with copies made for Monroe's own records. And Monroe, sitting at his desk with the lamp burning low, stared at the map on his wall for a long time and thought about Ruby Garner and what he was going to do now. The railroad still needed the corridor. He still needed the Garner property for it. Nothing about that had changed, but something in Monroe had changed considerably. He had spent 6 weeks trying to buy a piece of land from a woman who would not sell it, and somewhere in that time, he had stopped thinking of the land as the thing he needed and started thinking of Ruby as the person who mattered. He was not naive enough to think that the dissolution of Holt's scheme changed anything between them. She had no reason to sell to him, no reason to trust him beyond the specific help he had offered and delivered, and every reason to continue exactly as she had been. Independent, immovable, stubborn in the way that mountains are stubborn not out of defiance but out of the simple fact of what they are. He needed to talk to her again, not about the land, just to talk to her. He told himself this was a reasonable impulse and not at all complicated, and he almost believed it. Ruby heard from Walt Emery, the head foreman Monroe had sent, that there had been no further activity on her south fence line for 4 days running. She had also heard, through the specific and efficient communication system of a small county where everyone's business was everyone else's concern, that Monroe Chandler had ridden south to Holt's place and come back looking like a man who had said his piece and meant every word of it. She was feeding her remaining cattle one evening, the long August light turning everything amber and rose, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see Monroe coming along the fence line at a slow walk. He was not riding with the purposeful energy of a man on business. He was riding the way a man rides when he is not entirely sure of his destination. He stopped at the gate and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I heard from Austin," he said finally. "The situation with Holt and the railroad has been resolved. He has no claim, no arrangement, no authority to touch your property or threaten you in any way." "I heard you went to see him yourself," she said. "I did. That was not a safe thing to do alone," she said. Something about the way she said it, not accusing or admiring but simply noting it as a fact, the same way she would note the state of the weather or the condition of the soil, reached Monroe in a place behind his ribs. "No," he agreed. "It was not especially safe." She looked at him for another moment, then looked at her cattle, then looked back at him. "Have you eaten?" he blinked. "I beg your pardon. It is supper time," Ruby said. "I made enough chili for 2 people as a matter of habit. If you are hungry, you are welcome to come in." Monroe tied his horse and followed her into the house, and sat at the same table he had sat at 3 days before, but this time it was different. This time there was a cast iron pot on the stove that smelled extraordinary, and corn bread in the oven, and Ruby moved around her kitchen with the ease of someone absolutely at home, and the room felt less like a negotiation and more like something else. Something he did not have a precise word for but recognized by the way it made him feel settled and alert at the same time. They ate and they talked, not about the land and not about the railroad, about other things. She told him about her father, not the grief version, not the loss, but the real version, the man himself. James Garner, who had sung hymns while he worked because he claimed it made the mule cooperative, who had taught Ruby to track deer through the mesquite by the time she was 8, and to read weather in the behavior of the cattle by the time she was 12, who had believed, with a conviction that was almost theological, that the worst thing a person could do was let someone else decide what their life was worth. Monroe told her about his father too, which surprised him slightly. He did not usually talk about his father in personal terms, only in the context of the ranch and its history. But he found himself telling her about Thomas Chandler, who had come to Texas from Virginia after the war with nothing but a horse and a grudge, and had decided somewhere along the way to set the grudge down and do something useful instead, who had taught Monroe that the only real measure of a man was whether the land he was responsible for was better when he left it than when he found it. "That is what I believe too," Ruby said, and there was something in her voice when she said it, a resonance, as if 2 strings tuned to the same note had been plucked at the same time. They sat at that kitchen table long after the chili was finished and the corn bread was gone, talking while the lamp burned lower and the night pressed close against the windows. And at some point, Monroe became aware that he was happier in this small kitchen on this woman's farm than he had been anywhere in recent memory. He left when the lamp was very low, saying good night at the gate with his hat in his hands, and Ruby stood on the porch and watched him ride down the road and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The particular warmth of another person's genuine interest. The strange comfort of being understood. She told herself this was not complicated. It was supper and conversation, and a fair exchange of information. Then she went inside and sat by the window in the dark for a while, which was not something she ordinarily did, and thought about the way Monroe Chandler had listened to her talk about her father as if every word was something he wanted to remember. In the weeks that followed, Monroe found reasons to ride past the Garner property with a frequency that even he understood was not entirely explained by legitimate concerns about Holt. Holt had, in fact, gone very quiet. He had not appeared in Laredo. He had not sent his men to Ruby's fence line. Monroe's foreman Walt Emery reported no incidents whatsoever, and Monroe kept the watch going anyway because it gave him a professional reason to stay involved in something that had become deeply personal. Ruby, for her part, began leaving a second coffee cup on the table when she heard his horse on the road. This was not an invitation. She told herself it was not an invitation. It was simply practical, because he arrived at the time of day when coffee was appropriate, and it was unnecessary to take out and put away a cup twice when one could simply leave it out. Monroe never said anything about the second coffee cup. He simply sat down and picked it up and they talked, and it was the best part of every day that he rode out there. He told her about the ranch, the practical realities of running 40,000 acres with a reduced crew because the cattle market had been soft. She told him about the irrigation system her father had built along the creek and how she had been improving it, adding channels that her father had sketched but never finished, because the idea of completing his work felt like a way of continuing a conversation with him. "Can I see it?" Monroe asked one morning, and she looked at him with an expression that was still assessing, still careful, but no longer closed. She showed him the irrigation system along the creek, and he stood in the muddy bank and looked at it with the eyes of a man who understood land and water, and said it was the most intelligent piece of water management he had seen in Laredo County, and Ruby felt a rush of pride so strong it embarrassed her slightly. "My father drew the plans in the last year of his life," she said. "When he could not do heavy work anymore, he sat at the table and drew plans." Monroe looked at the channel she had dug, at the careful slope she had calculated to maintain the flow rate, at the way she had lined the sides with flat stones to prevent erosion. "He taught you well," he said. "And you went further than his plans." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because these stone linings were not something anyone was doing in this part of Texas in 1880, he said. "You learned that yourself or figured it out." She was surprised. He had read the innovation correctly. "I read about it in a farming journal," she said. "Tried it on a small section first to see if it held." "You tested your own hypothesis," he said, smiling now, openly and without the careful business mask he usually wore. And the smile changed his face completely, made him look younger and more human, and Ruby looked away because the effect of it was a little startling. September arrived and the heat began to ease by small degrees, and Monroe found himself thinking about the railroad situation with increasing clarity and increasing discomfort. The company would want an update. Cleve in Austin had been patient, but the patience of railroad executives was a finite and precisely measured resource. They needed an answer about the corridor. Monroe sat with this for a long time before he arrived at a conclusion that he knew, even as he arrived at it, was not the conclusion a purely business-minded man would have reached. He wrote a letter to Cleve proposing an alternative. It was not the alternative he had been trying to find 6 weeks earlier, the different route that the survey had ruled out. It was a different kind of alternative entirely. He proposed that the railroad alter its approach to the southern end of the corridor. Instead of running the line across the Garner property, he proposed using a strip of his own northern range, which would require building a slightly longer spur line but would accomplish the same connection. He had not proposed this earlier, because it would cost him a significant portion of his best grazing land along the northern boundary, and would require the company to fund additional track at their expense. He proposed it now because it was the only solution that did not require Ruby Garner to leave her home. He would absorb the cost of his own land. He would negotiate with the company for the track expense, and Ruby could stay. Cleve replied within the week, and the tone of the reply told Monroe that the company had been growing worried enough about the Holt situation to be accommodating. They agreed to the spur line. They agreed to fund the additional track. The deal was restructured, the paperwork revised, and the Garner property was formally removed from the corridor acquisition. Monroe did not tell Ruby immediately. He wanted to make sure the agreement was final and signed before he said anything. He rode out to get the signed documents from Cleve's representative in Laredo, a process that took 2 days and a significant amount of his own legal costs, and then he rode to Ruby's farm. It was a Wednesday morning in late September, and she was at the creek working on the irrigation channels, knee-deep in the water with her skirts hiked up and her boots sitting on the bank. She heard him coming and looked up, and her expression when she saw him was unguarded in a way that his chest registered before his mind did. "Come away from the bank," he said. "I have something to show you." She waded out and sat on the bank and pulled on her boots, and he handed her the documents. She read them in silence. The silence went on for a long time. He watched her face change as she understood what she was reading, the careful control of her expression giving way in stages, a process he watched with the same attention he had once watched a desert rain, something rare and extraordinary and nothing like what he had expected. When she finished, she looked up at him. "You gave up your north pasture," she said. "A portion of it," he said. "Monroe," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice was different from anything he had prepared himself for. "This cost you." "It was the right solution," he said. "It cost you," she said again, more quietly, and this time it was not a financial observation. He sat down beside her on the creek bank, which put them side by side looking at the water, and said, "Ruby, I have been wanting to say something to you for several weeks now, and I have been trying to determine the right moment, and I am not sure the right moment is going to present itself, so I am simply going to say it." She waited. "I came to your farm 6 weeks ago as a business proposition," he said. "And somewhere in the course of being told, with admirable frequency and precision, exactly where that proposition could go, I have arrived at a situation that has nothing to do with business and everything to do with you as a person. And I am aware that the timing of this is very strange and that my position in this situation has not been without complication, and I do not have a perfectly constructed way of saying it, but the truth of it is that I would very much like, if you are willing, to continue doing what we have been doing. Talking, sitting at your table, looking at your irrigation channels." Ruby looked at the water for a moment. "Looking at my irrigation channels," she repeated, and there was a quality in her voice that was a breath away from laughter. "And anything else," he said, "on whatever terms make sense to you. I am not interested in dictating terms." She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded he had ever seen from her. The control was still there, the bedrock of it, but the surface had opened up, and what was underneath was something warm and considered and very real. "You sacrificed your best grazing land," she said. "A portion," he said again. "For me," she said. "For you," he agreed. She looked at the water again, and then she looked at the farm, at the land spreading around them in the September light, green where the irrigation had kept it, amber and tawny at the edges, the mesquite trees moving in a light wind, the barn her father had built board by board in the summer of 1867. She thought about what her father had told her when she was 15, and asking him why he had never remarried after her mother died. He had said that some people you let leave because leaving is what they need, and some people you hold because the holding is what is true. The trick is knowing the difference. "All right, Monroe," she said. He turned to look at her. "All right," she said again, and this time the smile she had been almost giving him for weeks arrived completely, open and genuine, and the most remarkable thing he had seen in years. He did not kiss her on the creek bank. That was not who either of them was. What he did was reach over and take her hand where it rested on the bank between them, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while, looking at the water she had learned to manage, and the land she had refused to leave, while the September wind moved through the mesquite trees, and the mockingbird started up again in its particular, unrepeatable way. The autumn of 1882 moved through Laredo County, the way autumn moves through country that has been through a hard summer, slowly at first and then all at once, the heat breaking in October into something clear and cool that made everything feel possible. Ruby's cattle were fattening on the fall grasses, the irrigation channels were running steadily, and the fence line that Holt's men had tormented through the summer stood straight and solid. Daltrey Holt had. It emerged gradually through the county's reliable information network, sold his operation south of the line, and removed himself from Laredo County entirely. There was talk that federal investigators had begun asking questions about certain activities connected to railroad land acquisition, and talk also that Holt had concluded that the intelligent response to federal investigators asking questions was to not be available when they came looking. Ruby felt no particular satisfaction about this. He was simply gone, and the threat was resolved, and she directed her energy toward the work that remained. Monroe came to the farm most evenings now, sometimes for supper, sometimes simply to sit on the porch after the day's work and watch the stars come in from the east. He had never been a man who spent much time watching stars, but he found that doing it with Ruby changed the quality of the activity entirely. She knew the constellations from her father, who had learned them from a naturalist's almanac, and taught her by pointing with a work-roughened finger at the cold Texas sky. She told him their names and their stories, and he listened the way he had been listening to everything she said since July, with complete attention and a growing sense that the world had gotten considerably larger and more interesting than it had been before. He told her things in return. About the ranch, about his father, about the particular loneliness of running a large operation alone, which was a different kind of loneliness from the one she knew, but was lonely in its own way. He was not given to self-disclosure, had not been raised in a family that encouraged it, but with Ruby it was different. She received what he said without commentary or judgment, simply absorbed it, and occasionally said something that reflected back to him a version of himself that was more comprehensible than the one he had been living with for years. In October, he asked her to ride with him to the northern boundary of his range, where the spur line construction had already begun. She agreed, and they rode out together in the morning, side by side across the open country, and he watched her look at the land with that attentive, reading gaze she had, taking in the grass and the water, and the sky with the eyes of someone who knows that the land has a language if you bother to learn it. They reached the construction site, where a crew of 30 men was laying track across the northern pasture with the methodical efficiency of people who had done this work before. The foreman came to speak with Monroe about the schedule, and Ruby stood back and watched the work, and when Monroe rejoined her she said, "It is good work. Clean lines." "I can say the same about your irrigation channels," he said. She looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "It is one of several I have been accumulating," he said. "I have been pacing myself." Ruby laughed. It was the full laugh this time, not the shadow of one, and it caught Monroe entirely off guard and left him standing in the middle of his own north pasture feeling like a man who has just seen something he had not known he was waiting to see. "Monroe," she said, still smiling, looking out at the construction, "are you courting me?" He had not been expecting the direct question, though in retrospect he should have, because Ruby Garner did not do indirect. "Yes," he said, "I am." She was quiet for a moment, watching the track layers work. "I am not easy to court," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I have been attempting it for 3 months, and you sent me away 4 times before I got past the porch." "5," she said. "You keep forgetting the day after." "5," he agreed. She turned to look at him, and what he saw in her face was something he had been watching develop over the course of the autumn, the careful, controlled reserve she had been carrying since before he met her, slowly and deliberately laying itself down, not disappearing. She would never be someone without that fundamental guardedness, but choosing to set it aside for him, which was a different thing entirely and one he did not take lightly. "I am not going to sell my farm," she said. "I know," he said. "I never want you to. I am not going to be someone who needs managing," she said, "or someone who asks permission for decisions about my land." "Ruby," he said very steadily. "I have been watching you manage 200 acres, a drought-damaged cattle herd, an irrigation system, a harassment campaign, and a persistent suitor simultaneously. The last thing I would ever do is try to manage you." The expression on her face was the most complex he had ever seen from her, all of it at once, the wariness and the warmth and the humor and the grief and the determination, all present together, and he thought that if he could learn to read that expression the way she read the land, he would be a very fortunate man. She reached over and took his hand, the same gesture he had made on the creek bank in September, and they stood together watching the track go in across the north pasture, while the October wind moved the grass around their boots. November brought the first real cold, and with it the completion of the spur line's northern section. The construction crew moved on toward the border, and the quiet returned to Laredo County with the particular completeness of a place that has only ever been temporarily disturbed. Monroe's operation ran smoothly. The Chandler cattle were brought in from the summer range and settled into the winter pastures, fat and healthy. The financial arrangement with the railroad company was formally concluded, and Monroe's holdings were, as he had calculated, significantly more valuable than they had been a year before. None of this interested him nearly as much as the evenings on Ruby's porch. He asked her formally to court her at the beginning of November, which she pointed out was somewhat after the fact given that he had already been courting her for 2 months, but she accepted formally anyway. He met the widow Pierce, who ran the general store, and who told him with the authority of someone who had known Ruby Garner all her life that he was either a very brave man or a very foolish one. And Monroe said he hoped it was the former, and the widow said, looking at him carefully, "Well, you might do." He met Ellis Prout, the deputy, who shook his hand and said he was glad things had worked out because he had been genuinely worried about Miss Garner's situation through the summer. And Monroe thanked him for telling Ruby what he had heard at the saloon, because without that information the whole situation might have unraveled in a very different direction. December arrived, and with it a particular quality of cold that turned the mesquite trees silver with frost in the mornings and made the air sharp and clean. Monroe brought Ruby a book on advanced irrigation techniques he had ordered from a publisher in Chicago, which was perhaps not the most conventional romantic gesture, but which made her look at him with an expression of such genuine pleasure that he resolved to remember it as a useful approach. She gave him in return a careful sketch she had made of his north pasture from a distance, the track cutting across the grass, the sky above it enormous and pale, done in pencil with the accuracy of someone who had been looking at land her whole life and had learned to see it truly. He had it framed. He put it in his office. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in late December, standing in her kitchen where he had first sat down with difficult news 6 months before. He did it simply, without speeches, because with Ruby, simplicity was always more powerful than decoration. He told her that he loved her, which he had said before in smaller increments but not yet all at once in those specific words. He told her he wanted to spend his life on land, the same as she did, and that he did not care which land, hers or his or some combination of both, only that she was on it too. He asked her to marry him. Ruby stood at her kitchen table and looked at him for a long moment, and her face did the thing he had come to love, the layered thing, all the parts of her present at once. And then she said yes, in the clear, direct, final way she said everything, and Monroe felt a relief so comprehensive it seemed to reorganize his entire interior structure. They were married in February of 1883 in the Laredo County Church, which was a small wooden building with leaky windows and the best acoustics in the county because of the way the ceiling vaulted. The widow Pierce cried openly and without any embarrassment. Walt Emery, Monroe's foreman, stood as witness and managed to look both proud and uncomfortable in equal measure, which was his usual expression at formal occasions. Ellis Prout attended in his full deputy's uniform and shook Monroe's hand again with the same congratulatory energy, he had deployed at their first formal meeting. Ruby wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in a cedar trunk for 9 years, and which fit her as if Garner had known, somehow, what shape her daughter would grow into. The dress was cream-colored, simple, worn at the hem but carefully mended. Ruby wore her hair down for the first time Monroe had ever seen it that way, dark and thick and reaching past her shoulders, and he looked at her walking down the aisle of that leaky-windowed church, and the part of him that had spent 32 years looking at things in terms of their practical value was entirely and permanently undone. They did not sell either property. They ran them together, which required coordination and more riding back and forth between the two sets of buildings than was strictly efficient, but which neither of them had any interest in changing. Monroe spent most of his time at the Garner farm, because Ruby had always been at the Garner farm, and because the house there, with its hand-hewn table and its iron cookstove and its shelves of Garner's preserved jars, had become the place that felt like home. Monroe moved his office equipment to the room off the kitchen that had served as James Garner's storage room, cleared it out, set up his desk, and pinned his maps to the wall. Ruby's sketch of the North Pasture moved with him and hung beside the maps where he could see it while he worked. The spring of 1883 was unusually wet, which was as close to a miracle as most Texas ranchers allowed themselves to believe in. The irrigation channels Ruby had built and improved ran full with no need of supplementing, and the cattle on both properties put on weight with a steadiness that made Monroe check his figures twice, because he was not entirely sure he was reading them correctly. Ruby walked her father's land in the green spring light with an expression Monroe had learned to recognize as the deepest version of her happiness, the quiet, settled, certain kind that she did not perform for anyone. In the summer, they discovered Ruby was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, on a July morning in 1883, 1 year almost to the month from when he had first ridden up to her fence line. She told him matter-of-factly because that was how Ruby communicated important things, directly and without drama, and then she watched his face with the careful attentiveness she brought to everything. Monroe sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. "About this?" She looked at him with that layered expression, everything present at once, and then she said, "Yes, Monroe, very much." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that in the July morning while the mockingbird started up in the mesquite tree and the day began to warm around them. The baby was born in March of 1884, during a cold snap that brought ice to the windows and frost to the mesquite trees for the last time before spring finally arrived to stay. The birth was attended by the doctor from Laredo, a capable and unhurried man named Dr. Fontaine, and by the widow Pierce, who had delivered more babies in the county than she could accurately count, and who arrived with a calm and comprehensive competence that Monroe, sitting in the kitchen with his heart somewhere near his throat, found deeply reassuring. It was a boy. They named him James Thomas Garner Chandler for both their fathers, which Ruby had decided on weeks before, and Monroe had agreed to without hesitation, because the rightness of it was immediate and obvious. James Thomas was small and loud, and had, from his first hours, a quality of absolute certainty about his own requirements that made Monroe look at Ruby with an expression that said, very plainly, "I see the resemblance." Ruby, resting in the bedroom with the baby in her arms, saw that expression and said, "You did the same thing when you wanted your way. You were simply better at disguising it." "I was never disguising anything," Monroe said, sitting on the edge of the bed carefully. "You hid behind your business propositions for 6 weeks, she said. "That was a genuine business proposition," he said. She said, in the tone of someone who is not convinced and does not feel the need to argue the point. Monroe looked at his son, at the small, red, vehement face of him, at the way Ruby held him with the same steady competence she brought to every physical task, and felt the particular emotion that exists at the intersection of joy and terror and overwhelming gratitude, the one that has no precise name but that every person who has loved this specifically recognizes immediately. James Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed his mother around the farm with the devotion of someone learning a religion, and followed his father around the ranch with the concentration of someone taking notes. He was walking by 11 months, talking in full sentences by 18, and opinionated about everything from the moment he had words for his opinions. The county generally agreed that the combination of Ruby Garner's stubbornness and Monroe Chandler's determination had produced a child who was entirely himself and somewhat exhausting in the most admirable possible way. The Chandler operation, the two properties run as one, continued to grow through the mid-1880s with the steady productivity of well-managed land and attentive people. Monroe expanded the cattle operation into the southern pastures that Ruby's improved irrigation had made newly viable. Ruby expanded the irrigation system into sections of Monroe's north pasture that had historically been too dry for reliable grazing, a project she worked on through the summer of 1885 with the focused energy of someone who has been given a larger canvas. She tested her ideas on small sections first. Then she replicated what worked. Monroe watched her do it and occasionally helped dig channels and more frequently just watched, because there was something in the way Ruby worked that he never stopped finding worth watching. In 1886, the county got its first real newspaper, and the editor, a young man who had come west from Ohio with ink-stained hands and a formidable ambition, came to interview Monroe about the railroad's impact on the region's economy. Monroe answered his questions thoughtfully and completely and then said, when the editor was packing up his notebook, that the most significant piece of economic infrastructure in the county's southern sector was the irrigation system on the Chandler Ranch, developed by his wife, and that if the editor was interested in something genuinely worth writing about, he should speak with Ruby. The editor came back the following week with his notebook. Ruby sat across from him at the kitchen table, James Thomas occupied with a wooden horse at her feet, and talked about water management in arid land with a specificity and depth that made the editor's pen move faster and faster. The resulting article ran in the paper's third issue and was reprinted in a farming journal in Dallas, and two ranchers from neighboring counties wrote letters asking if Mrs. Chandler would be willing to consult on their own water situations. Ruby wrote back to both of them with detailed, practical advice that she sent without charge, because her father had believed in the free sharing of useful knowledge, and she had inherited this belief along with the land. One of the ranchers, a woman named Adela Torres who ran a cattle operation east of San Antonio, wrote back to say that the advice had worked better than she had hoped, and enclosed a pressed flower from her garden with the letter. Ruby pinned it to the kitchen wall beside a sketch James Thomas had made of the mule. The mule, it should be noted, had outlasted everyone's expectations by a considerable margin, living to an age that Dr. Fontaine, who also treated the county's livestock, considered improbable. Ruby treated this as evidence of the mule's determination rather than any particular veterinary miracle, and Monroe suspected she was correct. Daltrey Holt's name surfaced once more, briefly, in the winter of 1886, when the federal inquiry into railroad land acquisition practices in the southwestern territories concluded its work and published a report. Holt was named in the report as an example of the kind of independent operator who had exploited ambiguous arrangements with railroad officials to apply illegal pressure on landowners. The report used the word coercion and the word fraud with the careful precision of federal language, and recommended legislative changes that were eventually enacted in some form. Monroe read the report in his office with a particular satisfaction and then put it away, and did not think about Holt again. In 1887, Ruby discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Monroe in the same matter-of-fact way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table in the morning, while James Thomas was outside in the yard apparently engaged in a serious conversation with the chickens. "How are you feeling?" Monroe asked. "Strong," she said. And she was. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, the summer mild, and Ruby worked her irrigation channels until the last month, when Monroe asked her, carefully, if she might consider letting him and Walt Emery handle the heavier sections, and she looked at him for a moment and then said, "All right, but I will supervise." She supervised. Monroe and Walt Emery dug channels, and Ruby stood on the bank and told them where they were doing it wrong, and they adjusted, and she said better. And by the end of August, the new section was complete and Ruby pronounced herself satisfied. The second child arrived in October of 1887, when the mesquite trees were turning and the air had the particular clarity of a Texas autumn. This time, it was a girl. They named her Monroe Chandler, for Ruby's mother and for Monroe's grandmother, and she arrived into the world with a quietness that was entirely different from her brother's vehement entrance, looking around the room with wide, serious eyes as if she was taking inventory. James Thomas, 3.5 years old and thoroughly accustomed to being the center of everyone's attention, inspected his sister with the careful suspicion of someone being introduced to a new variable in a familiar equation. He declared, after a thorough examination, that she was smaller than he had expected, but that her fingers were interesting. Monroe held Monroe in the lamplight of the bedroom while Ruby rested, and looked at his daughter with an expression that was the same one he had had with James Thomas, the complicated, wordless one, but familiar now. He knew it when it arrived, recognized it as the particular signature of this specific kind of love. Ruby watched him from the bed, her face soft with tiredness and contentment and something else, the deep, settled certainty of a woman whose life is exactly what she decided it would be. "She has your eyes," she said. Monroe looked. The eyes were gray-blue, not brown, and would likely change, but for now were indeed his color. "Let us hope she has your sense of direction," he said. "I spent most of my 20s going the wrong way." "You found your way eventually," Ruby said. "I was considerably assisted," he said. She smiled. "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed, the baby between them, and Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder. And the October wind moved around the old farmhouse that James Garner had built board by board, and Ruby Garner had refused to leave, and Monroe Chandler had ultimately chosen over every other option that had ever been available to him. And the lamp burned warm and steady, and outside the mockingbird in the mesquite tree made its particular, unrepeatable sound. The years moved forward the way good years do, with the satisfying accumulation of seasons and work, and the small, daily evidence of life being lived correctly. James Thomas grew into a boy who was everywhere at once, helping with the cattle in the morning and disappearing into the creek bottom in the afternoon, to pursue investigations of the natural world that he documented in a series of composition books that he kept in his mother's cedar trunk. He had his mother's focus and his father's confidence and a curiosity that was entirely his own. Monroe grew into a child of deliberate, careful ways, who watched everything before she committed to it and who, when she did commit, was absolutely immovable. Monroe looked at his daughter sometimes with an expression of perfect recognition. Ruby pretended not to notice. In 1889, Texas became the 28th state admitted to the Union, and the formal structures of statehood arrived in Laredo County, with a combination of bureaucratic complexity and civic enthusiasm that kept the county seat busy for months. Monroe served on the Land Registration Committee, which required more meetings in town than he would have chosen, and which Ruby teased him about with the specific, knowing quality of someone who is aware that you are impatient but believes you can manage it. He managed it. He came home from the town meetings with the particular expression of a man who has spent several hours in rooms that smell of pipe smoke and politics, and Ruby poured him coffee and asked him what had been decided, and he told her, and she asked sharp, practical questions about the land registration provisions, and by the end of the conversation, he was always feeling considerably better. The irrigation techniques that Ruby had developed and shared through the farming journal began to spread through the region with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a genuinely useful idea. She received letters from farmers across South Texas and into the New Mexico territory asking questions, and she answered every one. She visited 2 properties in the county at the request of their owners and assessed their water situations and made recommendations, and both properties saw measurable improvements within a season. Monroe watched this with the satisfaction of someone watching a fire catch properly, the way it spreads outward from the center and becomes larger and warmer than its origin. He told Ruby once, in bed in the winter dark, that he thought what she was doing with the water knowledge was as important as anything else happening in the county, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "My father would be glad of that." "I know," Monroe said. "He would have liked you," she said. "He was suspicious of men who were too smooth about things, but you are not actually smooth, you just look like you might be." "That is an interesting distinction," Monroe said. "He would have seen past it quickly," she said. "He was good at reading people." "Where do you think you learned it?" Monroe said. She was quiet for another moment, and then she moved closer to him in the winter dark, and the old farmhouse settled around them with the particular sound of a structure that has been built to last. James Thomas, at 7 years old, became passionately interested in the cattle operation with a specificity that surprised even Monroe, who had expected his son to have multiple interests before settling. But James Thomas had his mother's quality of commitment, and once he had decided that the cattle were his primary concern, he pursued the education with a thoroughness that made Walt Emery, who oversaw the boys' informal apprenticeship, shake his head and say to Monroe privately that the kid already knew more about cattle health at 7 than some of his hands had known at 20. Monroe relayed this to Ruby, and she said, with the serene certainty of someone who is not surprised, "I know." Eleanor Me, at 5, had discovered books with the intensity of a scholar discovering a discipline they were born for. Ruby ordered books from the publisher in Chicago that she had used to order Monroe's irrigation volume, and from a bookseller in San Antonio, and Eleanor Me consumed them with a focused attention that was, Monroe reflected, a recognizable family trait. She read everything available to her and asked questions about what she did not understand, and the questions were never simple. The summer of 1890 was dry again, the way Texas summers have a right to be, and Ruby's irrigation system was the difference between adequate pasture and something dangerously short. 2 neighboring farms, whose owners had not taken up the irrigation improvements, sent word asking if they could draw from the Chandler channels temporarily, and Ruby said yes without hesitation, and adjusted the flow routing herself to accommodate the additional draw without compromising the home fields. Monroe watched her do this with the map spread on the kitchen table, James Thomas looking over her shoulder asking questions that she answered with complete patience while she worked, and felt the same thing he had felt that first morning on the creek bank when she had shown him what she had built. The particular quality of astonishment that comes from being married to someone who is genuinely more capable than you had fully understood, and discovering that this makes life larger rather than smaller. By 1891, the Chandler Ranch and the Garner Farm, still called by both names depending on which direction you came from or who you were talking to, was recognized throughout the county as one of the most productive operations in the region. The combination of Monroe's cattle expertise and Ruby's land and water knowledge had produced something that neither would have built alone, which was, Monroe thought, a reasonable definition of what a good marriage was supposed to do. They sat on the porch in the September evenings the way they had always done, watching the stars come in from the east while the children were inside. James Thomas read by lamplight or wrote in his composition books. Eleanor Me was usually already asleep, having determined that rising before dawn to watch the cattle was worth the early bedtime. Monroe and Ruby sat in the porch chairs that had been there since before he came, chairs that James Garner had made himself from mesquite wood, and they talked or they did not talk, and both were comfortable, and the land spread around them in the dark, living and breathing and permanent, the thing that had brought them into each other's orbits, the thing Ruby had refused to give up, the thing Monroe had ultimately come to understand was worth protecting. "Do you ever think about that first summer?" Ruby asked him one evening. "Frequently," he said. "You were very persistent," she said, "irritatingly so." "I was motivated," he said. "You were motivated by a railroad contract," she said. "Initially," he agreed, "and then by considerably more specific reasons." She looked at him in the dark with that expression he had been reading for 8 years now, the layered one, everything present at once. "What were they?" she asked. "The specific reasons?" "Your irrigation channels," he said. She laughed, the full laugh, and he listened to it with the same attention he had been giving it for 8 years, and with the same effect, the sense of something rare and true arriving exactly where it should. "The way you looked at me the first time," he said more quietly, "like I was a problem you had already solved." "You were," she said. "And the way you said my farm is not for sale every single time, as if you were simply stating a law of nature," he said, "which, to be fair, you were." "It is a law of nature," she said. "This farm is not for sale. That has not changed." "No," he said, "it has not." He reached over in the dark and took her hand, the same gesture that had been theirs from the beginning, the first offered and the first accepted, and she held it the way she held everything that mattered, with absolute certainty and no ambiguity whatsoever. The stars continued to arrive from the east, one by one, and then all at once. The mesquite tree made its sound in the light wind. The old farmhouse stood steady on its limestone foundation, built to last, refusing the years with the same quality its owner had once refused a man on a horse who came with money and ambition, and left with something entirely different. Inside, James Thomas fell asleep over his composition book, his pen still in his hand. Eleanor Me slept with the quiet certainty she brought to everything, dreaming whatever dreams formed in the mind of a child who had been born to parents, who loved each other completely, and who lived on land that was worth keeping. The night deepened around them, and Monroe Chandler held Ruby Garner's hand on the porch of the farm she had refused to sell, and the land that her father had found and her mother had loved, and she had kept at any cost breathed around them in the Texas dark, alive and permanent and entirely theirs. In the spring of 1892, Eleanor Me asked her mother why the farm had 2 names. She asked this at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, with the directness of a child who has been raised in a household where direct questions are answered directly. Ruby looked at her daughter, 7 years old, with Monroe's gray-blue eyes and Ruby's jaw, and a gravity that was entirely Eleanor's own. "It has always been the Garner farm," Ruby said, "because my father built it and my mother loved it and I kept it." "And the Chandler Ranch?" Eleanor asked. "Your father's land to the north," Ruby said, "which is also ours now." "Why do they have different names if they are both ours?" Eleanor asked. Monroe, at the stove pouring coffee, glanced over his shoulder. Ruby met his eyes briefly. "Because they were 2 things before they were one thing," Ruby said, "and the names remember that." Eleanor Me considered this with the focused deliberateness she brought to all information. "Like how you and Papa were 2 people before you were one thing," she said. "Something like that," Ruby said. Eleanor Me nodded, satisfied, and returned to her book. James Thomas, who had been listening from the doorway with one boot on and one boot off in the way he often operated, said, "But you were never actually one thing. You are still 2 people." "James Thomas," Monroe said, setting down his coffee cup. "It is a valid point," James Thomas said. "Put on your boot," Monroe said. James Thomas put on his boot with the expression of someone noting that the conversation has been deflected, but declining to push further at this moment. He went outside to check on the cattle with Walt Emery, and the philosophical question remained, momentarily suspended, in the warm kitchen air. Ruby looked at Monroe across the kitchen. "He is right, you know," she said. "We are still 2 people." "We are," Monroe agreed. "It is better that way," she said. "Two people who choose each other, not one thing." Monroe looked at her across the kitchen with 8 years of accumulated knowledge and continuing astonishment and said, "I chose correctly." Ruby picked up her coffee. "Yes," she said with the certainty of someone stating a law of nature. "You did." Outside, James Thomas was arguing with Walt Emery about the best grazing rotation for the South pasture, making points that were, by Walt's later admission to Monroe, not incorrect. Eleanor Me came downstairs with a new book under her arm and sat in the shaft of spring morning light by the window and opened it without looking up. Entirely at home in the world she had been born into, entirely certain of her place in it. The mockingbird started up in the mesquite tree. The farm breathed around them, the 200 acres that Ruby Garner had kept at any cost, that Monroe Chandler had ultimately protected rather than purchased, that James Garner had built from nothing with a mule and a letter, and the knowledge of what was worth keeping. The irrigation channels ran full in the spring wet. The cattle moved through the South pasture with the unhurried purpose of well-managed animals on good land. The mesquite trees, ancient and patient, held their ground in the limestone soil the way they had always done and always would. It was not a perfect life. No honest life is perfect. There were dry years and difficult seasons and arguments about grazing rotations, and the occasional meeting in town that lasted too long and left Monroe, with the tobacco smell and politics expression that Ruby teased him about with enduring consistency. There were days when the land required everything they had and gave back less than they needed, and they gave more anyway, because that was the nature of the commitment. But it was a true life, built from true decisions, kept by true people, growing in the direction of something more rather than something less. The kind of life that is built on the refusal of certain losses and the acceptance of certain costs and the discovery, somewhere along the way, that the thing you were protecting and the person you were becoming were the same. Ruby Garner had said her farm was not for sale. She had said it to bankers and to buyers and to a man on a horse who came with railroad money and quiet confidence and more persistence than anyone had warned her about. She had said it the way she said everything true, clearly and finally, as a statement of nature rather than negotiation. She had been right. The farm was not for sale. It was something else entirely. It was the ground on which everything worth keeping had been built, and it would remain so through all the seasons that came after, tended by hands that knew its value, loved by people who understood what it meant, carrying forward the names of the ones who had loved it before. This was what Monroe Chandler had found when he rode up to her fence line in the summer of 1882, looking for a parcel of land and discovering instead the most important thing he would ever be trusted with. He had not bought it. He had earned it in the way that the best things are always earned, by understanding, finally, what it actually was.